Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today it's finally time to talk about the new album from Scarface, titled Deeply Rooted. Now, as I said before, it's hard to talk about legends. Artists with careers that span decades and have made history in their own respective genres, legends in the industry. But you know what becomes the hardest? When you go and invest the hours of work to go through an entire lengthy discography of one of these legends, and then realize that a fair chunk of it wasn't really all that great. And yeah, I'm talking about Scarface here. Member of the Ghetto Boys and legend of Houston hip-hop. On his own, the man has put out about a dozen albums of material, and I went through every single one of them, including the double albums. And when I started, I was really excited. Scarface throughout the first half of the 90s might not have seemed to do that much outside of the gangster rap formula on the surface, but he brought personality, damn solid wordplay, and a selection of some pretty great old school funk and soul to his beats. Now, So Hold, his album The Diary, is damn close to a classic, thing the depression that has crept through all of his work to underscore his bleak insight about the black community in the 90s. It's a classic of that era of hip-hop. But going beyond that, there's a gap about 10 years where the albums were kind of mixed to say the least. Quite frankly, there's only so many places that Scarface could take his brand of gangster rap, and it got really repetitive in a hurry. Coupled with an influx of weaker guest stars and production that could be kind of hit and miss, and you're left with a lot of filler albums. Enough that I can kind of understand why, despite his longevity and his presence in the underground as a figure of southern hip-hop, his name doesn't always come up as much as it probably should. Really, consistent quality only began to return to albums like Made and Meritus, after the latter of which Scarface announced that he was retiring. And really, I was kind of okay with that. Go on a high note, nothing wrong with it. And that's why the announcement of a new album this year threw me off guard. You have to wonder what it was that pulled Scarface out of a solid 8 years of retirement that was really only split up by a mixtape in 2010. One of the closest things to a significant departure in and around hip-hop that wasn't caused by prison or drug addiction or death. But to be fair, the guest verses that I've heard from Scarface over the past decade have been really solid, especially when he worked with Freddie Gibbs on Pinata. So, did Scarface come back with anything worth caring about? Well, he came back with a Scarface album, for better or for worse. To some extent, you get what you always expect from this guy on his comeback record, and while it definitely is solid, I'd argue it's not really great. And the frustrating thing is that it's not one big factor that prevents this record from being among the star-making comeback releases of this year, but a scattered pile of nuisances that I'm surprised were never really addressed earlier, and led to me not quite liking this album as much as I wanted to. But let's start with the one element that works consistently well and does reflect the high standard of quality. Scarface himself. The guy has a voice made for hard-edged gangster rap that's expressive and commanding and capable of real grit, yet also versatile enough to show some emotional complexity when you start digging into the darker moments of this album. And while there are some moments that go for more of a modern sound and a bit of a modern flow, Scarface doesn't force himself to conform to any choppy trap flows, make anything that would initially make it look like he's fighting for mainstream relevance. He's been in the game so long, he's long been confident of his own flows and bars in this place in hip-hop. And on that place is of the deeply depressed, occasionally suicidal gangster rapper who's simply been through so much hell that the lighter moments of this album just viewed as moments of respite. And while there are more lines that I'd like about his flagrant disregard towards women, including in the middle of the gospel-inspired All Bad that completely breaks the tone in the album low point song Anything, this record does take enough time to delve into Scarface's broken relationships on Keep It Movin' and Voices that has surprisingly vulnerable context to the damaged man behind the microphone. The hardest gut punch of this album when the facade cracks on the latter track and Scarface in a disbelieving tone, I think I failed at something. And that's saying a lot coming from a veteran gangster rapper. For him to admit something like that is a really powerful moment. But those are only the first humanizing moments, because Scarface doesn't shy away from the storytelling that used to be the rule in gangster rap rather than the exception. From the crooked arrest on the hot seat that includes prison rape in the psalm, to the blacked out suicidal hoarder of Steer, to the stark loss of religion on God, where he goes high concept to examine what he would do if he took on the role of God, even if it's just a role that he can fill. And while I don't love the majority of the hooks on this album, more on this in a bit, John Legend absolutely kills this plea to see proof of God's existence with a sort of gravitas that Hobson wished he could have brought to Illmind Hobson 7. And on the topic of guests, I'd be remiss to mention the two guest stars of Do What I Do. First from Rick Ross, who actually isn't bad and brings in a decent level of detail, until Nas just sweeps in and steals the entire song. Hell, between this and his verse on Fast Sean Something to Believe In, maybe a new Nas project might be worth it in the future. But really, you come to a Scarface record looking for bloody takedowns on enemies and snitches, vivid imagery, and a nihilistic view of life on the streets that come with Scarface knows he's damned already, despite everything he's done. And he does deliver that. The closest thing to modern comes is the more trap-inspired bang banger of Dope Man Pushin'. But beyond that, there's Rooted, which was solid, the extremely hard-hitting No Problems, which I really liked, and unfortunately the low point of Fuck You Too, which might have worked if it wasn't for the casual homophobia that didn't need to be there, and a diss to Lil Wayne that frankly came out of nowhere and feels about 2 years late. And calling him a nerd? No disrespect here, dude, but if you're looking for rappers who play to the nerd set in the modern age, there are far better targets than Lil Wayne's borderline has-been current status. It just feels like a shot for no apparent reason. But look, with all that I just mentioned, you'd think this would easily fall among some of Scarface's best material, right? Well, here's where we run into a big issue that I did not expect for this album. Instrumentation, production, and hooks. Despite the ominous pianos of the intro and the outro, some of the organ hits, and some of the rougher beats that might call a little bit back to soul, this record really doesn't have that soulful texture and feel in the beats and the synth lines. They feel shockingly clean and polished, with barely any grit to cultivate that darker atmosphere. There are moments that get kind of close, the washed out bass against the organs and keys on Rooted, the old school shimmering cascade of the Hot Seat, the more funky bass against the slightly sharper cymbals on Anything, the wheedle of the guitars on Do What I Do, but for some reason Scarface tries to embrace more electronic tendencies and they feel only a shade less clumsy as when Eminem does it with hard rock on his recent work. Steer started off with some decent blurry melancholic tones before the symphonic vocals started clashing with the choppy thin waves and electronics, and Voices had a really good acoustic line before more symphonic vocals were brought in for a hook that really did overwhelm the song, and not in a good way. That's the other thing. Scarface brought in a slew of R&B and hip-hop singers to handle the hooks, and while John Legend and CeeLo Green do fine, and Papa Roach does shockingly well in his two features, the rest are not nearly as soulful or textured for a record like this that needs to maintain that darker atmosphere for its tone. The worst probably coming from Rich Andruws on Anything, or Avant on Keep It Movin'. And look, I get Scarface wanting to keep it up instrumentally with the times. He's always aimed to do that in all his releases. And hell, both Dope Man Pushin' and No Problem showed that his rougher tones can work against harsher, more abrasive production. He sounds really quite good. But when you counter it with the far cleaner gospel of All Bad or God, or all those symphonic moments that just feel kind of goofy, it feels like this album is reaching for bombast while neglecting the finer details and grit, the swell to actually earn that symphonic power. Hell, if there is a record screaming from a feature from Aloe Black, or even the gospel-inspired post-punk and noise of Algiers, and incidentally, it's only a matter of time before that group gets it either sampled or contributes production to hip-hop, mark my words, it would be Deeply Rooted. It needs that symphonic power that has a little bit more grit and texture, and it doesn't really get it. So in the end, I went into this album, and indeed Scarface's entire discography, looking to find some killer gangster rap, and while I will say that Deeply Rooted probably does fit pretty close to the upper end of the scale of Scarface records, I really want to love this album a lot more than I do. I'm not saying it's bad, it's definitely not. As a project, it has moments of soul and emotional impact, and Scarface is a way with imagery that really does stick in the brain, but it's just a shame that everyone else around him outside of Nas really can't rise to that level. Makes me wish that Madlib and Scarface could have teamed up like Madlib did with Freddie Gibbs. But for me, with this, it's a solid 7 out of 10 and a recommendation, especially if you're a Scarface fan, but if not, it's some solid gangster rap from an OG. At the end of the day, you gotta respect that, especially coming back like this. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, or any of their albums coming out that you want me to take a look at, I'd be more than happy to give them a listen. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time. Young niggas already need hair dye, alcoholic faces, women bad.